So, funny story, this is actually my second time recording this video. The first time I recorded it, I apparently did not have the sound on. So I was just talking to myself for, 45 minutes. So hopefully with this video, we will have sound. If not, well, you won't be watching it, will you? So this is the second ethical scenario I'm going to be going through with the CHIA ethical decision-making process for healthcare interpreters. I specifically made this video for my students because we went over scenario 1 in class. So if you're on my YouTube channel looking for scenario 1, there is not a scenario 1 video. We start off with scenario 2. So we're going to be going, like I said, through CHIA'S ethical decision-making process with this particular scenario called cursing at the doctor. So let's take a peek at what this scenario entails. The patient you're interpreting for begins cursing at the doctor because they're upset with their medical treatment. They don't call the doctor any names, but they use a lot of profanity to express how upset they are. So this is one of those situations where, for a lot of medical interpreters, this is an ethical dilemma. And I say for a lot of interpreters. For some interpreters, this is a very clear-cut choice. To them, it isn't an ethical dilemma. There are no ethical principles in conflict. So that just really highlights the fact that when it comes to medical interpreting ethics, it can be very subjective. People come to very different conclusions about these things. So that's really what the CHIA ethical decision-making process is designed to do, to try and sort of standardize this process so we can all at least come to somewhat similar conclusions. Therefore, we have that kind of consistency in service across medical interpreters. But I digress. So with this particular scenario, a lot of interpreters have issues with this because they're like, I'm supposed to, on the one hand, be respectful of the doctor, be respectful of the patient, but if I'm going and lobbing around F-bombs, saying bad words, well, that's kind of a problem, isn't it? And on the other hand, we're supposed to be accurate and complete. So in this case, we kind of have two, at least, ethical principles in conflict, which is why this is sort of an ethical dilemma. So that's why we're going to use the CHIA ethical decision-making process to see, okay, how should we handle this situation? And it's a pretty concrete process. It has 6 steps. So the first step is to ask questions to determine if there is a problem. Sometimes when you do this step, you come to find, you know what? There isn't really a problem here, and you kind of already know what to do. However, step 2 goes a step further. Step 2 is the only step that has 2 parts. That's important. So the first part of step 2 is to identify and clearly state the problem. Chances are, if you're having a hard time doing that, well, you might need to go back to step 1. Part 2 of step 2 is to consider the ethical principles that may apply to this particular situation and ranking them in applicability, how important they are, how related they are to the situation. So we need to remember that just because, according to the NCIHC, we have 9 ethical principles, according to CHIA, it's actually less, but they're very, very similar to NCIHC's ethical principles. And I do have a video on my channel in which I go over the differences between the 3 medical interpreting codes of ethics in the United States. But of those 9 ethical principles, and even the 6 ethical principles as outlined by CHIA, they're not listed in order of importance. There is one ethical principle that occasionally kind of rises above the rest, and that has to deal with, NCIHC calls it advocacy. CHIA says that it's something that we should have in mind anyways, which is the health and well-being of the patient. So in certain situations, the health and well-being of the patient may kind of rise to the top and be the most important thing. But generally speaking, we're not really ranking in terms of, I want to make sure that I honor this ethical principle more. We're supposed to sort of balance them. But in this case, we're ranking how applicable they are, how related they are to the problem. And we'll take a look at this step here in a few moments. Step 3 is to clarify personal values as they relate to the problem. Step 4 is to consider alternative actions, including benefits and risks. Step 5 is to choose one of those actions that you just considered and carry it out. And step 6 is to evaluate the outcome and consider what might be done differently next time. The last 2 steps. In step number 5, we're going to be able to choose an action, but we're not really going to be able to actually carry it out to do it. And then, of course, we're not really going to be able to do step 6 in the sense that we're not going to be able to see the real world outcome of our particular choices. However, I'll kind of give you an example at the end of how it might turn out and how you can use that information to, like it says here, consider what might be done differently next time. So if there are any points of this, any steps of this process that you're kind of like, wait, what does that mean? No worries, we're going to go over each step. I'm going to try and divide this video into chapters so you can kind of click around and, jump to different parts of the video. But if you find this whole process, the 6 steps, it's pretty wordy, I'm not going to lie. If you find it difficult to remember, I also have a video on my channel in which I help you memorize the CHIA ethical decision-making process to kind of internalize it a little bit more. So without further ado, we're going to go ahead and examine our scenario. So in scenario 2, again, the patient you're interpreting for begins cursing at the doctor because they're upset with their medical treatment. They don't call the doctor any names, but they use a lot of profanity to express how upset they are. So the first step of this process is to ask questions to determine if there is a problem. Again, to some medical interpreters, they might be like, no, there's not a problem here. I'm supposed to interpret everything accurately and completely. I would encourage you, though, if that's your thought, to kind of go through this process anyways, because if you really put on your critical thinking cap, you will find that there are other ethical principles that come into play here. And like I said before, we don't rank our ethical principles. Accuracy is not important than, let's say, respect, okay? We need to weigh and kind of balance out these choices and choose the best option that's going to honor the most ethical principles and hopefully violate the least amount of ethical principles. But of course, that's not always going to be the case if the patient's health and well-being is at risk. So we're just going to go ahead and say that, yes, this is a problem. We're going to ask questions. We're going to be like, well, why is it a problem? Why is it a problem that the patient's cursing at the doctor? Well, that's disrespectful to the doctor. And as an interpreter, I have to be accurate and I have to interpret that nasty stuff that the patient's saying to the doctor. If I'm following the ethical principle of accuracy. So, in this instance, I would say it is a problem because it's kind of an ethical dilemma where you have ethical principles in conflict. So then we're going to move on to step 2, which again, you remember, this is the only step that has 2 parts. So the first part of step 2 is to identify and clearly state the problem. So we kind of already did that in the first step, didn't we? But this is an excellent opportunity for you, and I'm going to do this at the beginning of each step, except for the first one. The first one is, we're just going to assume that there's a problem regardless, because that's why I'm making a video, right? But right now, I would say if you want to do this step yourself, see if you can't put into your own words what the problem is, go ahead and pause the video and give yourself an opportunity to do that. If you feel the problem is different from the way that I've stated the problem, or I am going to state the problem here, please let me know in the comments. I definitely welcome different perspectives here, and I do feel that it's really important to engage with other interpreters when it comes to working out these ethical scenarios. So again, pause if you'd like to work this out yourself. Otherwise, we're going to go ahead and continue and see what I've written down here. So the problem here, as I stated it is, you're supposed to interpret everything. But if you're interpreting profanity, it might, and here's where the problems come in, offend the provider, so be disrespectful to the provider. It might make you seem unprofessional. And you know what? There's lots of other bad things that could potentially happen if you're cursing at a provider. The provider could very well potentially report you. They might be unhappy with that. You don't know how the provider feels about profanity. Maybe the provider is very, very much against profanity, and then in the process of you interpreting it, you offend them, even though you've made it clear, of course, in your pre-session that you're interpreting in the patient's voice, which just goes to highlight that sometimes you can do what you feel is the right thing or what objectively is the right thing. I'm not saying to interpret it or not is the right or wrong thing. We're not at that point yet. But yeah, sometimes you can do the right thing and still end up with negative consequences. And I think that's one of the hardest lessons in life. Didn't mean to get all philosophical on you there, but, there's a lot to learn from these ethical scenarios. So we've clearly stated the problem. So now we're going to move on to part 2 of step 2, which is to consider the ethical principles that may apply and ranking them in applicability. So you remember, we're not ranking them in order of importance. We're ranking them in order of how much they relate back to this problem. So this is a really, really good time where if you would like to pause the video so you can go ahead and try this step yourself, you're welcome to do it. Actually, I'm going to show you real quick before, if you are anticipating pausing to work this out yourself and see what your ranking of ethical principles is, I have a little tip for you right here. So usually what I like to do is, well, first off, we got to put up our ethical principles, right? And these are just in order of how they're listed in the NCIHC Standards of Practice, the National Council on Interpreting in Healthcare. So we have accuracy, we have confidentiality, we have impartiality, respect, cultural awareness, role boundaries, professionalism, professional development, and advocacy. So these are the 9 ethical principles as outlined by the NCIHC. So I actually don't rank all of the ethical principles, unless I really feel like I need to, because chances are the ethical scenario that you're looking at, it's going to be really hard to drag in every single one of our ethical principles. You can try, but it's kind of challenging. And I really don't think it's necessary. I usually like to rank my top 5. So if we rank our top 5 here, again, in order of applicability, how much they relate back to the problem. This, again, if you're trying to pause to work this out yourself, this is an excellent time to do that. So go ahead and pause if you'd like to work it out yourself, and I will resume here in a moment with how I ranked the ethical principles. All right, so let's see how Kelly ranked her ethical principles. So at the top of this, because to me, it really, really seems like the issue here is that we feel like we're going to be disrespectful. So that's why I put respect at the top as the most relevant. Again, yours might look a little bit different, and that's okay. Again, ethics isn't black and white. It's open to interpretation a lot of the times, and we're interpreters. We're allowed to interpret, right? So I put professionalism second, actually, because I feel like that's very closely related to respect. Okay, if we do the thing that we're supposed to do, we're going to look unprofessional. Again, the thing that we're supposed to do is be accurate, which is kind of like the golden rule of interpreting, which is definitely why I put it in my top 3. Why I didn't put accuracy before respect, I think, generally speaking, if an interpreter is going to choose to be accurate or not, it's because of the respect or the professionalism things, which is why I kind of put accuracy third and I put those first. But yours could very much look different, and you might see accuracy first, then respect and professionalism, or accuracy, professionalism, respect. That's fine. Generally speaking, though, I would say you should probably have the same top 5 that I do. So the next one that I put here is impartiality. So impartiality is all about, as I mentioned in one of my videos, biases, beliefs, opinions are like butts. Everyone has one, but no one wants to see yours. So when you're interpreting, you want to keep your biases, beliefs, and opinions to yourself. And part of that is taking sides. So it might seem like if you interpret the bad words that you're taking sides, or if you don't interpret the bad words that you're taking sides. So that's why I put impartiality here. And then the last one that I put, It might be different from yours, and that's okay. Like I said, the top 5 generally should be the same. I would say the top 3 or 4 should probably be the same as mine. But 4 and 5, there's a little bit of leeway there because some of it is open to interpretation. So number 5, I put role boundaries. And the reason why I put role boundaries is, let's say you deem what the patient is saying so offensive that you can't interpret it to the provider. So what do? Are you going to filter the message? Are you going to not interpret anything at all? So in that case, you have to ask yourself, and this is how I like to think about role boundaries. Maintaining boundaries, staying within the boundaries of the interpreter role involves, okay, we should hopefully all have taken our medical interpreter training. You're not banned from watching this video if you haven't. But generally speaking, we conceive of medical interpretation to fall within 4 roles, which are the conduit or the message converter, clarifier or message clarifier, cultural broker or cultural clarifier, and then lastly, we have the advocate or the patient advocate. So those are the 4 roles of the medical interpreter. Sometimes they have different names. Advocate being the most involved role of the medical interpreter. So if we're doing something that isn't within one of those 4 roles, what are we doing? Are we being an interpreter if we're just sitting there and listening and not interpreting? That's kind of how I like to think about role boundaries as it relates to this ethical scenario. However, you might have something different here, and that's okay. So now we have our top 5. We have respect, professionalism, accuracy, impartiality, and role boundaries. Whether your top 5 is the same as mine, exactly the same, whether your top 5 is a little bit different, it's kind of in a different order, that's okay. However, I would encourage you, if you're trying to work through this exercise yourself, to save your top 5 for later, because I'm going to be saving mine, and we're going to go ahead and move on to our next step, which is, well, we finished step 2, which has 2 parts, remember? So step 3 is to clarify personal values as they relate to the problem. So if you've watched that video that I mentioned earlier about how to remember the CHIA ethical decision-making process, you know that for this step, I pulled in a meme, therapy frog. So literally what you do in this step is you kind of check in with yourself. How does this make me feel? What are my personal values? What are my cultural values? What are my religious values? Things like that, how they relate to the problem. So I would say this is a great opportunity for you to pause and kind of reflect and consider that yourself. However, I would like to share kind of how I feel about this because it might be surprising to some of you. It might be kind of how you feel, though I suspect a lot of folks who are watching my channel will probably be like, Kelly. So when it comes to profanity, personally, I don't have a problem with it. In my personal life, I'm so bad. I'm so very bad. I'm sorry. I have to make a confession. I swear like a sailor. So to me, when it comes to swearing, even during a doctor's appointment, when I'm interpreting for a patient, it doesn't really bother me. And, I feel like generally speaking, we definitely use, as Americans, as United Statesians, more like lightweight bad words in our regular everyday speech, even in our professional speech sometimes. That's where I'm coming from. But I need to bear in mind, having taken into account my personal values, that not everyone feels the same way. And when I'm in the interpreted encounter, it's not about me. So if I'm interpreting for both a provider and a patient who take bad words very, very seriously, I need to take that into consideration as well. But I still need to move through my ethical decision-making process and see what the best course of action is. I will also say that if in this step you're coming up with #big feelings, what I would say is you definitely want to go back to step 2 and make sure that you've included impartiality. Because if you have big feelings about this, #big feelings, you need to make sure that you are considering the ethical principle of impartiality, because impartiality is about not letting your beliefs, biases, opinions interfere with the interpreted encounter. And the stronger your beliefs are regarding these things, the more likely it is that they will affect your impartiality. So we're going to move on to our next step, which is probably the biggest step in this whole process, which is to consider alternative actions, including benefits and risks. So this is where what I like to do, and I'm going to give you some tips before I am going to invite you to pause if you'd like to work through this yourself. What I usually like to do is I like to make a grid of first column being potential action, second column being the pros of that potential action, and then the third column being the cons of the potential action. So pros being benefits, cons being risks. And I usually like to examine at least 3 options, at least 3. Another thing that I like to do is I like to remember that not doing anything is also doing something. So that's a big thing from my philosophy classes in college is, well, if you don't pull the lever, you're still choosing to do something, even if it's not doing anything. And so this brings me to another important point. Now we're going to go all the way back to the scientific method in elementary school. Speaking of, in 3rd grade, Kelly won first place in the science fair. Pretty sure I still have that ribbon somewhere. And oh, wait, I have a picture. Here's my picture. Here's cute little Kelly in 3rd grade winning the science fair. But what I did was I was actually growing different plants and I was watering them with different things. And whenever you're doing a sort of science experiment, you always want to have a control group. So in my case, in my little project where I was growing little plants, I had one plant that I didn't water anything. So just like that, what I like to do, and each time I examine an ethical scenario, I like to include one action where I don't do anything, or I do the opposite of what I feel like I should do. The reason being because we always want to have what's called a control group. A control group is the group that we can kind of compare everything else to. You don't have to do that, but that's just a little tip for you. So I would say now is an excellent time for you to pause this video if you would like to work through this yourself. I will say that you want to choose 3 actions, and then you want to look at the pros and cons of each action. So first you need to choose 3 actions. So I would say go ahead and choose your 3 actions, and then you can go ahead and unpause the video and we'll continue. So for the rest of you, we'll take a peek at what my potential actions are, the 3 actions I chose to look at. These aren't all the possible actions. They might not even be the correct actions, but we're comparing them to one another, okay? So the first one, you remember what I like to say? I like to include something where I'm not doing anything, okay? In this case, my control group is going to be don't interpret the bad words. Now that can play out in terms of me censoring the words, using a less bad word in place of the bad word. Again, not saying this is correct, just saying that this is a particular action that we're going to be looking at. It could be that I just don't interpret anything at all. Again, not saying that's the correct action, just another kind of variation on this one. So the next action that I chose was to just interpret what is said. I feel like this is a response that I get from a lot of interpreters. Just interpret it. You're supposed to be accurate, so just interpret. So that is another option that I was going to examine. And then the last option is a little bit more complicated, reminding the patient that I'm going to interpret everything. So I'm going to expand on this a little bit later, exactly what variation on this particular action we're going to be looking at. But for now, this is what I have. This is the point where if you're doing this yourself, you have your 3 actions down. These are my 3 actions. Heck, you could even add my 3 actions onto your 3 actions if you want to look at 6 possible actions. Just be really, really thorough. But the next part of this is to examine your top 5 ethical principles and assign them to a pros or a cons column. So when we come up with our pros and cons, I really like to think of it in terms of ethical principles. So again, this is the time where you should probably pause the video if you would like to work it out yourself. If you need maybe some help, if that isn't abundantly clear to you, you can maybe watch the first row of my control group action of don't interpret the bad words, and then from there you can maybe proceed with your other 2 rows. So when it comes to not interpreting the bad words, if that's the action you choose, again, not saying it's correct or incorrect, well, the hope here is that we're going to be respectful to the provider in the process, because that's our big fear if we interpret the bad words, is that we're going to be disrespectful to the provider. However, we also have to think about the patient. Are we being respectful of the patient if we're not interpreting what they say? We're not. The patient chose to say that. So we need to remember that part of the ethical principle of respect is respecting patients' autonomy, which means we're respecting the patient's ability to make their own choices. So if you're not interpreting what the patient says, you're not respecting their choices. Unless, of course, they don't seem to understand that you're going to interpret everything. Maybe they said it not thinking you might not interpret it. But ideally, you should have given your pre-session. That being said, though, I'm going to bring up a little bit later how sometimes people don't listen to our pre-session. So that's something else to consider. So when it comes to professionalism, part of being a professional interpreter is following the codes of ethics and standards of practice. So if you're not interpreting, if you're changing the message, if you're filtering the message, are you being a professional interpreter? The pro potentially might be that it looks professional, when in all reality it isn't. But at the end of the day, I put professionalism in the cons column by not following through with your professional duties. We've already determined that the risk to this is you're not being accurate. You're also seemingly taking sides, in which case your impartiality is being affected. And then, again, that what I said before, if you're not being a conduit, a clarifier, a cultural broker, or an advocate, what are you doing? You're not really being a conduit here because you're not interpreting. You're either not interpreting at all, or you're just not interpreting exactly what the patient said. So in that case, you'd be violating the ethical principle of role boundaries. So hopefully we understand kind of how the pros and the cons go. You can always add other pros and cons to each column. Something that you could certainly add is you might lose your job, or keep your job might be a positive version of that. You don't have to limit it to just ethical principles. However, I think it's very important in the scope of this ethical decision-making process to at least consider the ethical principles. So if you want to go ahead and work through the next 2 rows, you're certainly welcome to pause the video and go ahead and do that. Otherwise, I'm going to continue and I'm going to go through how I ranked these pros and cons. All right, so our first action was don't interpret the bad words, right? We're going to kind of do the opposite of that. We're just going to interpret what's said. If you think about it, it's going to be kind of like the flip side of the respect coin, because in the first one, we were respecting the provider, but we were disrespecting the patient. But in this one, it's kind of like, at least this is how it feels, we're not respecting the provider, but we are respecting the patient's choice, their message, their ability to make their own decisions, their ability to choose what they're going to say. Next up with professionalism. So if we're interpreting what is said in terms of appearances, because we also have to think too, how are our actions perceived? They hear a bad word coming out of your mouth as the interpreter, everyone in the room might be like, well, that's unprofessional. So I do end up putting professionalism in the pros column simply because, well, like I said in the first one, okay, if we don't interpret the bad words, that's unprofessional because we're not following the codes of ethics. So in this case, we're following the codes of ethics, and what distinguishes a professional interpreter from an unprofessional interpreter is following those codes of ethics. So in that case, we kind of honor professionalism in a way. When it comes to accuracy, this is pretty straightforward. If we're interpreting what is said, we're being accurate. However, when it comes to impartiality, if we start saying bad words, we're interpreting what the patient says. So you have the patient saying bad words at the provider, and then you start saying bad words at the provider in another language. The provider's going to feel kind of ganged up on, so it might not seem impartial to the provider. Even if you're not interjecting your own thoughts, beliefs, and opinions about how you feel about uttering profanity into the mix, it still might not seem impartial to the provider because you and the patient are ganging up on them. And then when it comes to role boundaries, I mean, you're interpreting, you're sticking to the role of a medical interpreter, right? The next action that we're going to look at with our top 5 is reminding the patient that you must interpret everything. I said I was going to expand on this one a little bit because What do you do after you remind the patient that you must interpret everything? Well, ideally you'd interpret this to the provider, but are you interpreting what the patient said? So that's why I decided to qualify this action a little bit more. Remind the patient that you must interpret everything. Don't interpret what they said this time. So in this case, you're really not interpreting what the patient's saying, but you're reminding the patient of your responsibilities as a medical interpreter that you do have to interpret everything. This might come from the fact of what I mentioned earlier, that sometimes we have our pre-session and people might not always listen to our pre-session, or they might forget, or they might assume that this is one of those exceptions, those unspoken exceptions to being accurate and interpreting everything. So this is kind of giving the patient the benefit of the doubt. You're kind of saying, well, I'm not sure if you really meant to say that. In this instance, I'd say, okay, well, you're respecting the provider in the sense that the provider is not going to be exposed to disrespectful speech. But at the same time, I might even argue that you're kind of being disrespectful of the patient, or it might seem disrespectful to the patient because you're kind of making the choice for them. However, you're also giving them an opportunity to kind of, if they really wanted to say those bad words, they might say, no, I meant to say that. And then you go, oh, okay. But maybe they might feel disrespected by that. There's a lot of different ways you can look at this. However, when it comes to professionalism, I definitely put this in the cons column. Because you're essentially saying to the patient, hey, here are my responsibilities. And then right after mentioning what your responsibilities are, you're not following through with those responsibilities. That seems unprofessional to me. This is definitely one of those situations where if you have a different opinion than me, please let me know in the comments. We're not being accurate, of course, in this instance. We're also not being impartial. We're kind of taking the patient's side. And then when it comes to role boundaries, okay, we're not interpreting, kind of like the first one. So we're really not respecting those role boundaries. We're not being a conduit. We are switching to third person and using our third person interjections correctly, which is good, but you're not really doing the rest of what's required of you. So this is how I put them in the pros and the cons columns, weighed those risks and those benefits of each one of these actions that I'm looking at. Listen, I'm not even saying that one of these actions is the 100% correct action to take in this particular scenario, but we're just going to go through the process. I want to show you the process. And you know what? I'm going to even show you at the end how you can kind of tweak and fine-tune this process to come up with an even better outcome. So this is where I kind of like, and this is why I like to put each pro and each con on its own line. That way I can easily tally them. So when it comes to don't interpret the bad words, all right, we have 1 pro and 5 cons. When it comes to just interpret what is said, we have 4 pros and 3 cons. Remind the patient that you must interpret everything. Don't interpret what they said this time. 1 pro, 4 cons. Okay, so we're going to come back to that in a moment because our next step is to choose the action, and carry it out. So ideally, you will choose the option with the most pros and the least cons. However, like I mentioned previously, if the patient's health or well-being is at risk, that is really the only thing that might kind of outweigh everything else. If there's a situation in which the patient might, let's say the patient's going to have a really bad allergic reaction if you don't choose one particular action. I'd say that weighs pretty heavily, probably heavier than any pros you could come up with for any of the other actions. Definitely keep in mind that if the patient's health or well-being is at risk, you know what, you might kind of need to think about this a little bit differently. We're going to look at our pros and our cons here. We're going to look at our actions. So obviously, number 1 is out. Don't interpret the bad words, okay, because this has the least amount of pros and the most amount of cons. Just interpret what is said. This one definitely has the most pros, the least cons, whereas the third one is still kind of tied with the first one in terms of the pros, and it has maybe 1 less con. So I would say that out of all of these actions, the most correct action to choose would be to just interpret what is said. Again, not saying that that is the 100% correct option, just in this particular scenario, working through these particular options, of these 3 options, this is the best option. So, of course, we're not in the field. We can't actually do the thing, but we can kind of pretend, or we can even imagine what might happen. if we do this, if we just interpret what's said. This is where I like to tell my students, this is where you pretend like you're Dr. Strange, imagining one of those 14 million different possibilities. I would love to see in the comments if any of you chose a different action, if you examined different actions, what action you chose, how you might consider these last two steps. So we're going to go ahead and move on to our last step, which is to evaluate the outcome and consider what might be done differently next time. So I'm going to give you an example of a possible outcome. We're going to imagine that this is the outcome of the situation based on the action that we chose in the previous step, to just interpret what the patient says. So you interpret the patient's utterance accurately and completely into English. And then the provider goes, excuse me? That kind of language is uncalled for. Are you saying the patient said that? You know what? I don't care either way. There's no reason to use such foul language, and this goes for you both. Wait, what? Kelly, why would you give us a bad outcome? Well, you know what? That action isn't perfect. It could certainly use some tweaking. And you know what? Somewhere, in some way, in some universe, this could certainly happen. In fact, it's actually happened to me. I've interpreted the bad words that patients have said, and the provider has gotten upset with me. So in this particular situation, this is where we really need to examine this last step even closer. Consider what might be done differently next time. So we're going to consider some things. We're going to consider this first. Does the patient understand that you will be interpreting everything? Again, I've stated this before. Sometimes we give our pre-session and it goes in one ear and right out the other. Of course, if you didn't give a pre-session, that doesn't mean Kelly is by no means saying that you shouldn't give a pre-session. Just that sometimes when we give our pre-session, people aren't listening. Or maybe people are busy. Or maybe, sometimes people work over and over and over again with interpreters and they kind of become numb to it. Doesn't mean you don't give it. It just means that sometimes people need reminders. So we also need to consider, does the provider understand that you will be interpreting everything? Sometimes providers are already getting the chart for the patient pulled up on the computer while we're giving our pre-session. We don't have their full attention sometimes. They're doing a lot of stuff. So they might not have heard us. Or, like I said earlier, maybe the provider thinks that this is some kind of exception to I will interpret everything accurately and completely. So like I said, if you haven't given a pre-session, definitely give one. But also understand that sometimes our pre-session doesn't get listened to, and that in those instances, an interjection may be appropriate. So an interjection would just be to remind everyone that everything must be interpreted. I'm going to give you some examples of some interjections on the next slide. But another thing that you should be prepared for is if you do explain that you must interpret everything accurately and completely, sometimes you got to be prepared for the why. I cannot tell you how many times that I have reminded a provider of my role as a medical interpreter, and the provider says, but why? Or the patient or the provider might say something like, well, the interpreter last time did XYZ. So answering why is a strategy that I sometimes employ. I find it's very helpful, and it really helps us all get on the same page. So there are a couple of different ways you can handle this. So I said interjections. Something that I like to bring up, an interjection I like to use when things get kind of heated, or God forbid, I once had a provider start insulting a patient. This is what I like to pull out of my pocket. The interpreter would like to remind everyone that they must interpret everything accurately and completely, no matter the content of the message. So you could potentially interpret what the patient said, and then if the provider reacts negatively, give your third-person interjection, or potentially offer this interjection before you interpret. You could certainly examine both of those options if you return to step 4 of this process. You could examine those as well. A lot of times when it comes to working through ethical scenarios, the difficult part isn't choosing the correct action. It's figuring out the exact specifics of what you're going to say or how you're going to do what you're going to do. But sometimes, like I said, sometimes people ask why. And so sometimes I might preemptively include the why. So one of the whys you can use, probably the shortest one, is, as per the Medical Interpreting Codes of Ethics and Standards of Practice. Pro tip, never say, because of my code of ethics, because then they're going to think it's your own personal code of ethics, not an established, standardized national code of ethics. So this is why I like to say the medical interpreting codes of ethics and standards of practice. However, in some instances, this might seem a little dogmatic, like you're just doing it because someone told you to. So on occasion, I do like to explain to providers that from a health equity standpoint, I want to make sure that the non-English speaking patient or the limited English proficient patient has as close to the same experience as an English speaking patient would have. Might not necessarily fit this situation 100%, but I've certainly had instances where it's been useful when I've used this particular interjection. So this really highlights how we can use this ethical decision-making process to kind of fine-tune the choices that we make to resolve different scenarios, different situations that we might encounter out in the field. I highly, highly, highly encourage you to not just wait until you encounter one of these situations in the field before you engage in this decision-making process. I think it's really, really important to practice with these ethical scenarios on a regular basis. Yes, on a regular basis. Because what ends up happening is, as you practice, as you work through different scenarios, as you work through different possibilities, as you read about different problems, different scenarios that your colleagues are facing, maybe on online forums, maybe in just talking to your colleagues, you end up creating these sort of mental shortcuts as to, you know what? I've handled an ethical situation. I've worked through an ethical situation similar to this before. It's slightly different, but the correct course of action and the one that I examined was this. Chances are those ethical scenarios aren't so different to where that solution might not work. Because think about it. If you're handling one of these in the field in real time, a lot of times what's going to happen is you're going to be sitting there going, oh my gosh, I got to go through all 6 steps in 1.5 seconds. You might have occasional instances in which you can take your time, but generally speaking, you really need to be prepared. And like I've said many times to my students, and like I've already said in this video, you want to put on your Dr. Strange hat, you want to pretend that you're Dr. Strange and imagining all 14 million of those different possibilities and seeing how you could come up with a better solution so you can serve the patients and the providers that you interpret for and offer them the highest level of possible service.